On the night of May 3rd, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and just listened really intently to figure out, where the sound is coming from. But she just couldn't do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house, and at one point it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. I mean, it really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint, and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house. But then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it's 2, 3 in the morning, and it's just silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well, clearly it was some animal, or maybe it's a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. She's rationalizing the sound. It's gone now, so it can't be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing the sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary, she was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away tragically 11 years earlier in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of, his death. This is something that they really had never been able to move past. And so as Mary is laying here in bed and she's hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks maybe it's Cora, maybe she's doing something. But really what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt and how badly she missed her husband. Like she really just wished he was here, because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate. I'm gonna stay here. You go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He'd been gone for over a decade. And so eventually, even though Mary really didn't want to get up and go look for this tapping sound, because truthfully, she was just scared at this point, but she's thinking about her daughter, Cora, who's downstairs, and heaven forbid there's some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house and it could be hazardous. She doesn't know. So she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter's okay. And on top of that, her daughter, Cora, had recently had this really bad case of strep throat. And while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, this is an opportunity as much as anything to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she's okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage and she takes her sheets off and she gets up out of her bed. And at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It's all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she's out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door and there's nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she's looking out, but there's nothing. And the house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It's like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what? The sound has stopped. Everything's okay. I'm sure Cora's okay. I'm getting back in bed and I'm going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed. She did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled him up to her chin, and just hoped the sound wouldn't come back. And it didn't. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately kind of took stock and realized, okay, I'm okay. Everything seems fine in the house. She listened and didn't hear any knocking sounds. And she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits. And so Mary just kind of, breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign, but there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat, and then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she didn't really even know what they meant. She was kind of spooked by it, didn't want to scare her daughter, so it never came up. But they're chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there's very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen, in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the same sounds she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora as well is looking at her mom like, did you hear that? And Mary's like, you heard that too? You heard that tapping? And Cora's like, yeah, I think it's coming from the cellar. And Mary, she's like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, well, it sounds like it's in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they're rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is. And so Mary, who at this point is desperate to find a logical, non-scary explanation for what's going on here, just immediately goes down the stairs into the cellar and begins looking for mice that would prove that's all this is. It's mice making these sounds. But when she's down there, she's looking around and there's no mice, there's no sign of mice. And as she's down there, she starts hearing the tapping again. But now it's not coming from the cellar where they thought the sounds were originating. It's coming from somewhere above her. And as soon as Mary hears this tapping sound, she hears Cora reacting to it upstairs in the kitchen, like she was kind of startled by it. And so Mary runs back upstairs to the kitchen. She looks at Cora, and Cora is visibly distressed because she's like, I heard it. It was in here. It was in the kitchen or somewhere nearby. I didn't see anything, but I heard it. As soon as you went down there, I heard it. And so at this point, Mary is undeniably scared. She doesn't know what this is, but it's gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so Mary said, you know what? I'm going next door. They had a friend who lived next door, a guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door. And when he came, she explained that there's something happening. There's knocking sounds happening in my house. It's scaring me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, absolutely. I'll be over in a second. And so Mary goes back to her house and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen and periodically they're hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over and he comes inside and right away, when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary's like, what is that? And Cora, she's totally spooked. And the guy's like, I think it's your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is. And so Mary and Cora, they're like, great. Like, he seems pretty confident that that's all this is. And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he's checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he's checking all these different areas that as he's checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it's not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he's working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, when the tapping got really loud and it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing because it's nowhere near here, it's behind us. And the man, he turned around and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face is ashen. He really looked pretty upset. And he said, the last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they couldn't get out. And they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like. After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so Mary and Cora, they're left wondering, like, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she couldn't believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. I mean, he knows she's grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she's thinking about what he told her. That it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if these are ghosts? What if it's my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago trying to get my attention? What if they're trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued. And the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they'd come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house. And sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they'd all hear the tapping sounds, and nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers, people are talking about it all over the place, and in some ways that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight. But they also really didn't know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they're sitting at the table weighing out their options. Like, what do we even do? Even if this is, our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we can't live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on and on, do we eventually move? And so they're having that kind of discussion. And as they're sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It's practically on top of Mary and Cora, so much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started. And they both kind of looked at each other like, it's right on top of us, what's going on? And then as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of, the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she's sitting back, she saw something she had never noticed before. And immediately, she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat, and she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And Sydenham's chorea has a very different set of symptoms to strep throat. This condition, which is also known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly and not even know they're doing it. And so what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound, but had no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by Sydenham's chorea. Now, it seems like, well, how didn't Mary catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times Mary was not in the same room as her daughter. And her daughter did not know she was making the tapping sounds. So her daughter is genuinely scared of the tapping sounds because she doesn't know she's making them. And Mary doesn't know it's her daughter making them. And so combined, they're like, oh my gosh, what's happening in our house? And then before long, they had kind of gone down this path of, it's my dead husband, it's my dead father, he's the one making these sounds. And then it's like they had tunnel vision, as did all the other neighbors, as did the reporters. Everybody wanted this in some ways to be a haunting. And so nobody's checking to see if maybe Cora is tapping her feet or hands and creating these tapping sounds. Because again, Cora was fully convinced she was not making those sounds. But then finally, when she and her mom were sitting at the table discussing what they were gonna do 6 days after the haunting began, and they hear this really intense, close tapping sound, when Mary kind of leaned back to kind of take stock of the room and figure out what was going on, she noticed under the table Cora's foot stomping on the ground. Cora didn't know it was Sydenham's chorea. One afternoon in November of 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Petit was on break at her job in the city of Decatur, Alabama. And while she was sitting in the break room, she pulled out her phone and she called her 21-year-old daughter, Hannah. The phone rang a couple of times, then eventually Hannah picked up, and right away, Nicole could tell her daughter, Hannah, was still very much not feeling well. She could hear it clearly in her voice. So Nicole's daughter was a stay-at-home mom to two very young kids, which, was totally exhausting in its own right. And in fact, on this phone call, Nicole could hear in the background the sound of the kids yelling and running around and crashing into things, so clearly it was just chaos over there. But Nicole knew Hannah could not just be tired from tending to her kids, because over the last couple of months, what Nicole had noticed was every time she spoke to her daughter, whether her daughter's kids were going crazy or not, Hannah just completely sounded under the weather. And in fact, Hannah often was complaining, again over the past few months, of not only feeling a deep exhaustion, but also of feeling really dizzy and nauseous. Now, over the past few months, Nicole had been telling her daughter, you have to go see a doctor. This is not normal. This is not just parenting fatigue. Something is off. You need to go get looked at. But Hannah, who was known to be very, very tough and, generally didn't really go to the doctor much, she said to her mom, I'm fine. I'm just exhausted from the kids. It's no big deal. And so she kind of pushed that idea aside. And so this time, as Nicole's talking to her daughter, and she can clearly hear that her daughter is not better, she's still feeling awful, she knew trying to push her daughter to go see the doctor wasn't going to work. So instead, she said, okay, Hannah, when's Brian going to be home? Brian was Hannah's husband. And Hannah just sighed and she said, no, he's not home yet. I don't know when he's going to be here. So for the most part, Brian was, a very active parent and husband, but he also was a very successful chiropractor. And in fact, he had had so much success at his private practice that recently he'd even been able to fully renovate his building. And so with this new building and all this extra space and all this new staff, he was working even more than usual, which, financially was great for the family. But it meant he basically was absent all the time. And so it had become kind of commonplace that Brian was nowhere to be seen. It was kind of Hannah alone with the kids and this mystery illness she was suffering from. Now, Nicole obviously understood the nuance here. She knew that, Brian's practice was very important, not just to him, but to Hannah and their family. And so instead of, being upset with Brian, Nicole had tried very hard to make herself available to her daughter, to take care of her kids, to help her out whenever she could. But there was a limit to how much Nicole could help because Nicole also worked full time. And so she couldn't just be around all the time to help with her daughter. Like today, she was working. She wished she wasn't so she could go be with her daughter, but that was just the way it was. For the next couple of minutes, Nicole and Hannah just chatted like mother and daughter. And then at some point towards the end of the call, like Nicole always did, she told her daughter, hey, I really think you ought to go to the doctor. If you tell me what day you're going to go and you make an appointment, I'll go over and take care of your kids. I'll even take you to the appointment, whatever you need. Don't let logistics be the reason you don't see a doctor. Whatever you need, you let me know and I will help you if I can. I'll flex my schedule to accommodate yours. But like Hannah always did, she just kind of brushed off her mom and said, okay, maybe I'll go see a doctor. I don't know, but I think I'm going to be fine. I'm going to rest. I'm going to take vitamins. I'm going to eat well. I'm going to do all the things, and I'm sure this will pass. Nicole sighed when she heard this because basically she hears her daughter saying, I'm not going to the doctor still. But Nicole didn't argue. She just told her daughter that she loved her and she would see her soon, and then the two hung up. Over the next few weeks, Hannah continued to feel completely awful, nauseous, dizzy. All of her symptoms persisted and in some ways even got worse. But no matter how much pressure was put on her, namely by her mom, to go see a doctor, Hannah didn't. She really had convinced herself that this was just, parenting fatigue and that she would just get through it and she would be fine, which again was sort of very much her personality. She was this tough, hard-charging woman. She was going to just grit this one out. But then finally, in January of 2022, so now it's been months and months of Hannah having these symptoms and her mom basically begging her to go see a doctor. And by this point, Hannah can't argue with the fact that she is basically falling apart. She's lost so much weight, she actually can't even walk around her house anymore. She literally sits on a swivel chair, like a desk chair, and just pushes herself around the house. She is absolutely sick, and it's something that she can't even deny anymore. And so finally, in January of 2022, Hannah says, okay, Mom, I'll go to the hospital. Nicole, in some ways, was incredibly relieved that finally her daughter is doing the thing she should have done a long time ago. And then also, Nicole was just so annoyed with her daughter. Why didn't you go sooner? This is so silly. But regardless, Nicole's great. She tells her daughter, I'm gonna come over, pick you up, I'm gonna take you to the hospital, I'll be there with you. And so she goes over to Hannah's house, and when she gets there, Hannah in her chair wheels over to the door, and Hannah looks awful. She looks like she weighs less than 100 pounds. She's so pale. Her hair looks like it's falling out. I mean, she looks absolutely sick. She looks like there's something seriously wrong with her. But Nicole, she just takes her daughter and assists her down the stairs, puts her in the car. She also gets her kids and brings them along as well, and they drive to the hospital. And when they get there, eventually Hannah is brought into an exam room along with Nicole and the kids, and a nurse comes in and they begin checking Hannah's vital signs and asking her some questions, and they also weighed Hannah. And eventually, after that was done, the nurse told Hannah that, hey, you only weigh 84 pounds. This is way below what's considered healthy. This is like an emergency. And based on the other things you're telling me about over the last few months having these symptoms, I'm worried you might actually have stomach cancer. Now, even though Nicole had anticipated that something seriously was wrong with her daughter, it still hit her like a freight train to hear that her 21-year-old daughter had stomach cancer. I mean, she'd never even heard of somebody that young having stomach cancer. And when Nicole looked over at her daughter, Hannah too was horrified. I mean, for her, she still believed this was all just gonna pass. Whatever this is, it'll go away. But obviously, stomach cancer is not something that just goes away. A couple minutes later, a doctor came in the room and explained to Hannah and Nicole that the next step here was to test Hannah to see if she actually had stomach cancer. Now, the doctor said it was entirely possible this could be something else, but again, based on all the symptoms you've described and the sudden extreme weight loss, unfortunately, this really does appear to be stomach cancer. But we're gonna check, and in a couple of days, we should have an answer. And so Nicole and Hannah, despite obviously being shocked and scared, they both said, whatever we need to do, that's what we're gonna do. A few days later, Nicole was at home when her phone rang, and it was her daughter calling. Now, to this point, Hannah had gone in and begun doing some of the tests to see if she had stomach cancer, and they were waiting for some of the results to come back. And so when Nicole saw this call coming in, she's thinking, oh my goodness, this could be it. I could be getting the call where Hannah has been told one way or the other about this being stomach cancer. And so with quite a bit of anxiety, Nicole answered the phone. And when she heard her daughter was not telling her about test results. Her daughter, she was speaking in such a low tone that she could barely hear her, but she basically croaked out to her mother that she felt so sick, she had to be taken to the hospital right now. And so Nicole, she dropped everything, sped over to her daughter's house. And when she found Hannah inside, it was like Hannah could barely move. She was so fatigued. She was so sick, so pale, so skinny and malnourished. It was like her daughter was dying. And so she scooped her daughter up and she rushed her to the hospital. Later that day, Hannah was in a hospital room and was stabilized. When she had come in, she actually was showing signs of what's called acute respiratory failure, which basically meant her lungs were shutting down. And in fact, one of her doctors had told Nicole that had Nicole not gone over there and rushed her daughter to the hospital on that day, very likely she would have died. She would not have survived another 24 hours at home. So this was as close as you can come to, your daughter dying. But they had been able to stabilize Hannah, and she was now resting in bed, and they were now trying to figure out what to do. And one of the doctors pulled Nicole aside and said, look, we know she's being tested for stomach cancer, and we don't know if she has that or not yet. But acute respiratory failure is not connected to stomach cancer. And on top of that, it's incredibly rare for someone as young as Hannah. So we really don't know what's going on here. All we can do is keep her here, keep her stable, monitor her, and run some additional tests. And so Nicole, she said, okay, let's do it. And so for a few days, that's what the medical staff did. They just continued to monitor and keep Hannah stable while testing her to figure out how somebody her age and in her condition could be contracting respiratory failure. But after a few days of this, out of nowhere, Hannah has this severe sudden seizure. But after her seizure passed, the medical staff began investigating Hannah's brain because a seizure is a brain-related event. And as they're looking into Hannah's brain, they discover that she has also contracted viral meningitis, which is inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. And generally speaking, viral meningitis is not life-threatening, but in rare cases, it can be. And considering the fact that Hannah had other very serious medical issues going on, and the fact that her particular viral meningitis case was very severe. Doctors were worried that she could be someone who could die from this meningitis or potentially have very serious brain damage if they didn't do something drastic to combat this swelling in her brain. And so a decision was made to put Hannah into a medically induced coma so that she would lay perfectly still and they could just wait for the swelling in her brain to go down. But what that meant functionally was that Hannah would be in this coma indefinitely until, the swelling goes down in her brain or who knows what. I mean, basically the doctors didn't know what was going on with her. However, just a couple of days after Hannah had been placed in this medically induced coma, some of her imaging tests came back from all the testing they had run on Hannah to try to figure out what was going on here. And in particular, there were these imaging tests that came back from her abdomen. They had scanned her abdomen. And what they discovered inside of her abdomen was truly shocking. Hannah's entire digestive tract was covered in white spots. And the doctors all knew that those spots were not cancer. They were something worse. And after running a few more tests to confirm their theory, once they had that information that, yep, what we suspect is going on here, they called the police. So remember Hannah's husband, Brian? He's the very successful chiropractor. Well, his practice had been so successful that he had had the funds to fully renovate his office and build this bigger, better chiropractic practice. And that was great, not just for him, but also for Hannah, her whole family. They were making money hand over fist. Everything was great. Except there was an issue. One of the upgrades that Brian wanted to do within this renovated space was to include an X-ray room. And when people build X-ray rooms, they actually line the walls of the room with these big sheets of lead to keep the radiation from penetrating the walls. But lead is incredibly toxic and harmful to humans, especially if you ingest it or you touch it. It's not something you really want to interact with at all. It needs to be kept at a safe distance. But after the renovations were done and the X-ray room was built, there were several sheets of lead that didn't make it into the walls. They were sort of extra sheets of lead that just didn't get used and they were out in the open. And when police discovered that and they began investigating, they found somebody had been shaving off pieces of those extra lead sheets, little bits of lead. They were shaving them off and planting them inside of Hannah's vitamins that she took religiously every day, believing those were the things that were gonna make her healthy again. But in reality, sort of ironically, they were doing the opposite. She was literally poisoning herself every time she took one of those vitamins. And who was the person who was shaving off all that lead and literally trying to kill Hannah? Her own husband, Brian. All those white spots inside of Hannah's digestive tract were literally just pools of lead that had accumulated inside of her because her husband had been trying to poison her to death for months. Miraculously, though, Hannah would survive. After nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma, Hannah was healthy enough to be woken up and got to go back home with her kids. As for Brian, he was arrested, found guilty of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His motive was the $1.3 million in life insurance policies that he had taken out on Hannah. It had been a muggy day in North Texas on July 6, 2019, but the oppressive heat began to let up right as the sun set. And by 7 p.m., it had become an ideal summer night of about 73 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it seemed like the perfect Saturday night to go out in town. But 49-year-old Manuela Allen, known to her friends and family as just Manu, along with her husband Peter, had the house all to themselves that evening. So instead of going out to enjoy the pleasant summer weather, they decided instead to have a relaxing night in, just the two of them, on the couch just watching TV together. Peter and Manu had not had many evenings alone like this in their 23 years of marriage. And that was because they had spent most of those years raising their 4 kids. So this was a house that had constantly buzzed with activity and noise. But now, all but one of their 4 kids had graduated from high school, and their oldest son was away at college. So the house was getting quieter. And Manu and Peter were already thinking about how someday soon, it might just be the 2 of them living here. And as much as they loved their children, it was nights like this that made them kind of look forward to the day that they would be empty nesters. Peter grabbed his glass that contained some vodka from the end table and took a sip, and then he and Manu leaned back on the couch to watch a replay of a Texas Rangers baseball game.
Manu loved sports, and while baseball was not her favorite, it would have to do until football season rolled back around. Manu and Peter lived in the small Texas town of Olney with a population of just 3,000 people, and the nearest city with a major football team was over 2 hours away. But both Manu and Peter were teachers at Olney High School, and so during football season, they went to watch their beloved Olney Cubs play every Friday night. Manu didn't care that the Cubs were on the third longest losing streak in the state of Texas. She just loved going to support her students who were on the team, and she enjoyed the camaraderie of sitting in the stands along with her friends and her family. As a teacher, Manu felt responsible for her students, even when they were outside the classroom. So she dedicated a lot of her time to tutoring and mentoring students, especially the ones that seemed to have the most issues, even beyond just schoolwork issues. Kids that had problems at home or kids who had behavioral issues. Manu was all about helping those kids. But the upcoming school year and the roaring crowds in the stands on Friday nights felt really far away for Manu on this relaxing summer evening, and the sound of the baseball game on TV started to become white noise for her, and by 10 p.m., she could barely keep her eyes open. Peter noticed his wife nodding off, and he gently nudged her and asked if she wanted to go to bed. Manu looked over at the clock and said she should get some sleep. Peter gave his wife a kiss, and Manu stood up, and she shuffled down the hallway, entered the master bedroom, and closed the door behind her. Peter would not be joining his wife tonight in the master bedroom. He and Manu had this understanding that on any night when Peter drank, even if it was just one drink, he would have to sleep on the couch. So, with his glass of vodka still half full, this would be one of those nights. Peter continued watching TV and slowly nursing his drink, and he started to feel tired. And then around 11:30, the couple's 20-year-old son, Darian, came home. He let himself in with a key, nodded to his dad, and went upstairs to his own bedroom. But then, around 15 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. Peter stood up and groaned a bit as he walked bleary-eyed towards the front door. He unlocked it and opened it up. And outside the door stood the couple's 15-year-old daughter, Kiara. She said hi to her dad, walked right past him, and went straight to her room. Peter sat back down on the couch. The couple's 18-year-old daughter, Melanie, was away on a weekend trip with her friends, so she wasn't expected home. And at this point, it was close to midnight, so Peter dimmed the lights, reclined on the couch, and slowly drifted off to sleep while the TV stayed on at a low volume. A little after 8 a.m. the next morning, Peter woke up feeling like he could have used maybe another hour or two of sleep. Now, it was Saturday, and if Peter wanted to, he could keep sleeping. But even on these weekends, Peter just could not seem to sleep in. He just automatically got up. So Peter climbed up from the couch, grabbed his computer, and then went back to the couch to read some news online. At the same time Peter was doing this, his daughter Kiara had just woken up as well, and she was getting ready to go to the gym. But first, she wanted to put her dirty clothes in the washing machine. The Allen house had 5 bedrooms, but it was still a fairly compact house, just a little over 2,000 square feet. And the house was laid out in a way where Kiara actually had to go through her parents' master bedroom, which was right next to her own bedroom, in order to get into the laundry room. So Kiara stepped out of her room and then tried turning the knob to the master bedroom, but she found the door was locked from the inside. Kiara walked down the hall and saw her dad on the computer, and she asked him where Mom was. And Peter just said, "Oh, check the master bedroom." Kiara said she already had, and the door was locked. Peter then told his daughter to just go around through the garage, because in their house, the master bedroom had 2 entrances. There was one in the hallway inside of the house, which is the door that was locked, and then the other entrance was through the laundry room on the other side, which connected to the garage. So Kiara stepped outside of the house and went into the garage, and she walked into the laundry room, and then she reached the door that led into the master bedroom, and when she tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. So she swung it open, she stepped inside, and she froze, because what she saw was horrifying. Kiara turned and ran back outside, back around into the main house, ran to her dad and said, "Mom is not in the bedroom," and there was blood everywhere. Peter instantly sprung up, raced outside into the garage and into the master bedroom, and right away he stepped in this big puddle of blood in the carpet, and he looked around the master and there really was blood everywhere, and his wife was nowhere to be seen. Peter instantly thought his wife must be badly injured somewhere, so he ran from the master bedroom, with Kiara now following behind him, back into the garage and then out to the driveway, and that's when he realized Manu's car was gone. Peter turned to his daughter and said, Mom must have hurt herself and driven herself to the hospital. And so Peter called his wife's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. So a few minutes later, Peter and Kiara got into his car and they sped to a nearby hospital, thinking that's where Manu's going to be. But when they got there, Peter slowly drove through the parking lot of the emergency room looking for Manu's white SUV, but they didn't see it anywhere. So they parked the car and they went inside the hospital and asked the staff if Manuela Allen had been admitted, and they said no. So Peter and Kiara left that hospital, went to another nearby hospital, but again, Manu's car was not there and the staff said she had not admitted herself. And so Peter and Kiara returned home, and at this point, Peter dialed 911. And he explained to the operator that his wife was missing and there was blood all over her bedroom. The first officer who arrived at the Allen house met with Peter outside. He asked Peter what was going on, and Peter told the officer that he really had no idea. His daughter Kiara had come to him that morning saying their mom was gone and there was blood all over the bedroom, and then he went and checked and he saw the same thing, and then he went out to the driveway and he noticed his wife's car was gone. Peter explained that he and Kiara then drove to 2 hospitals thinking his wife must have gotten hurt and then driven herself to a hospital, but when they got to the 2 hospitals, his wife wasn't there and they said they had not seen her. The officer noticed that as Peter was explaining the story, he seemed totally calm and not shaken or panicked or really showing any kind of emotion, and that just seemed unusual to the officer, considering the circumstances Peter had just described. I mean, his wife, at a minimum, seems to have been gravely hurt if she's not already deceased. And so you would think that would elicit a bigger reaction. But the officer kept that to himself, and instead he had Peter lead him inside the residence to the master bedroom. And the first thing the officer noticed was that the bed had been stripped bare, and there was a bloody pillow on the floor next to the bed. And he did see blood spatter all over the room, across the mattress, the closet doors, and the wall. In fact, there was so much blood that the officer did not believe a person could survive having lost that much of it. And so he wondered to himself why Peter didn't immediately call 911 instead of getting in the car with his daughter and driving around to various hospitals first. It seemed obvious this was an emergency, so why wasn't it treated that way? Then the officer noticed something else on the bedroom floor. It was a knife. And so at this point, it was obvious this was a crime scene, so he asked Peter and Kiara to clear out of the master bedroom and go wait for him on their couch. And so after the father and daughter had stepped out of the room, the officer walked outside and went to the garage. And immediately, he saw bloody streaks on the ground, and he traced them through the laundry room and back to the door of the master bedroom. And he recognized these bloody streaks had to be drag marks. Everything the officer saw painted a picture of a very violent struggle having taken place in the bedroom, most likely sometime during the night. The officer then walked back into the house and observed bloody footprints leading from the master bedroom to the kitchen, right to a spot next to the refrigerator. And so the officer walked into the living room where Peter and Kiara were, and he asked Peter about these footprints and, why would somebody go into the kitchen potentially? And Peter explained that actually his wife kept her keys on a hook right next to the refrigerator, and her keys were gone along with her car. And so at this point, the officer radioed dispatch for help and said the police should now be on the lookout for Manu's vehicle, because clearly either Manu or someone who harmed Manu had taken the keys and taken the vehicle. A few minutes later, Sergeant Dan Burbeck of the Young County Sheriff's Department, along with a couple of local police from Olney, pulled up in front of the Allen house. And the officer who had first arrived on scene walked up to Burbeck and briefed him on what he had seen. After being briefed up, Sergeant Burbeck immediately walked into the Allen house and told Peter and Kiara that they would need to step outside. As Peter and his daughter walked out onto the porch, Peter told Burbeck that actually one of his other kids was still in the house upstairs. So Burbeck told the father and the daughter to stay outside, and then Burbeck walked into the house and upstairs to a second-floor bedroom, opened the door, and found 20-year-old Darian inside with his headphones on playing video games. Burbeck asked Darian to come outside with him, and Darian, who looked very confused, asked what was going on here. But Burbeck just said he needed Darian to leave the house right now. So Darian just did as he was told and stood up and followed the detective downstairs, and then he, along with Burbeck, joined Peter and Kiara outside on the porch. Once they were out there, Burbeck began questioning them, starting with the husband, Peter. Burbeck asked Peter, why did you sleep on the couch that night instead of in your bed with your wife? Peter explained the agreement he had with Manu, that whenever he drank, no matter how much, he would sleep on the couch. Now, Sergeant Burbeck kept this to himself, but right away he wondered, why would you have that agreement in place? Was Peter like a maniac when he drank? Did he get violent? What was going on here? Burbeck then proceeded to ask each member of the family if they had heard anything unusual during the night before, because Burbeck assumed someone in the house must have heard something considering the crime scene in the master bedroom. and the couch where Peter slept was only about 20 steps away from the master bedroom. Kiara was in the bedroom right next door to the master bedroom, and Darian was right above it in the upstairs bedroom. It just seemed impossible that such a violent struggle could have taken place with them not hearing anything. But Peter said he really heard nothing, aside from the sound of an engine, which he thought could have been his wife's SUV, starting up around dawn, and he said the sound actually woke him up, but he went right back to sleep and figured it was not a big deal, whatever it was. Burbeck asked Peter, is it normal for your wife to just get up and leave in the middle of the morning like that? Like, didn't you think to maybe ask her where she was going? Peter replied that it was not his job to keep tabs on his wife. Darian, who had been upstairs, said the whole night he'd had his headphones on and was playing video games. The only thing he said he heard over the course of the whole night was a rustling sound coming from the kitchen, sometime between maybe 3 and 5 a.m., but he figured it was just his dad maybe getting a snack. And then Kiara, who was in the room right next door to where her mother appeared to have been in some life and death struggle, said she really had heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, Burbeck, by this point, looked totally stunned by their answers, and so Kiara, who kind of picked up on his suspicion, she quickly explained that she had been out that night, and when she got home, she went straight to her room, slipped into her bed, put her earbuds in, which would have nullified the noise, and she FaceTimed with her boyfriend. And then after the call, she fell asleep still with the earbuds in her ears, which again could have prevented her from hearing anything. Burbeck didn't know what to believe here, but he just still felt like something was off. Maybe these family members know more than they're letting on. But he obviously had no proof, and so Burbeck told the family that, when he was done here at the house, he wanted them to come to the station so he could speak to them further. It was around this time that Lieutenant David Wilk was driving past the Allen family house when he saw the yellow crime scene tape stretched out around their property. Now, Lieutenant Wilk worked for the sheriff's department that was the next county over, so he had no idea what this crime scene tape was about, but he did know the Allens personally. In fact, his son was a football player at Olney High School, and the boy adored Manu. So Lieutenant Wilk just really liked the Allen family, and seeing the crime scene tape, it just made his stomach drop, because he knew, obviously, something bad had happened. Wilk immediately pulled over, got out of his car, and introduced himself to a local police officer he saw standing outside of the residence. And Wilk asked the officer, what's going on here? And the officer told Wilk that Mrs. Allen was missing, and it didn't look good. Wilk asked if there was anything he could do to help, and the officer told him that actually right now, other patrol units were out looking for Manu's white SUV, and so if Wilk wanted to, he could join in that search. And Wilk said yes, where should I look? And the officer suggested that maybe he explore the recreational area around Lake Cooper, which was a very popular swimming hole about 8 miles north of town. And so the officer gave Lieutenant Wilk a description of Manu's vehicle and her license plate number, and then Wilk left, got back in his car, and began driving north until he reached the lake area. There, he pulled into the recreational area and began driving along the perimeter of the lake. And as he approached a boat ramp, something on the other side of the lake near the dam drew his attention. It was a white SUV, just like Manu's missing vehicle. And so Lieutenant Wilk parked, got out of his car, and walked around the lake to where this white SUV was parked. And as Wilk got closer to it, he could see there was nobody in or around the SUV. He could also see that the SUV appeared to be stuck on a large mound of dirt, with all 4 wheels kind of hovering off the ground, as if somebody had driven it there, gotten it stuck, and then left. Wilk approached the driver's side of the vehicle, and he noticed there were brown smears near the door handle. He leaned in closer, and he saw that these smears were clearly bloody fingerprints. So immediately, Wilk turned on his body camera and proceeded to film and photograph the car, both outside and in, and also the area around it. And then when he was done, he decided to just go ahead and search the whole area, because obviously, this could be connected to Manu, and maybe she was out here somewhere. And so Wilk walked towards a fence that was a short distance away from the car, and then once he got there, he turned around and just began scanning the entire area. And that's when something else caught his eye. It was something off in the distance, beneath a thicket of trees. It looked sort of like a pile of laundry on the ground. Wilk began walking towards it, and as he did, he realized this was not just some pile of laundry. It looked like it was the outline of a white bed sheet, and very clearly this sheet was wrapped around something fairly big. And so Wilk picked up his pace a bit, and as he got closer, he began to see there were bloodstains on the outside of these sheets, and then when he was right on top, it was obvious that there was a dead body wrapped up inside of the sheets. Wilk had a sick feeling because he was sure the person who was inside of these sheets would be identified as Manu. And so he called into the Young County Sheriff's Department and said he'd found a dead body, and it was almost certainly the one they were looking for. Back at the Allen house, Sergeant Burbeck heard about the discovery of a body on his radio. And so now that this was officially a homicide case, he reached out to the state police, known as the Texas Rangers, for help. He arranged for Peter, Kiara, and Darian to be taken to the nearest Texas Ranger station, and then he got into his cruiser and drove down to the lake as other county and state police headed that way as well. Burbeck arrived at the lake, and Lieutenant Wilk led him to the body that was still wrapped in the sheets. Since Wilk was not working the case in any official capacity, he'd left the body as he'd found it. So Sergeant Burbeck leaned down and began pulling away the sheets and also some yucca leaves that had covered up the victim's face. And then once the victim was exposed, Lieutenant Wilk, who was standing nearby and who knew Manu personally, was able to positively identify her. Manu was deceased. Burbeck and a few of the other officers who had arrived put up crime scene tape while they waited for a forensics team to get there. Burbeck turned to one of the officers and shared his opinion that the killer was almost certainly someone Manu knew. He pointed out that the violence inside of her home was so brutal that it just seemed personal, and also the fact that her face seemed to be covered up with leaves when they found her, well, that was something he'd seen before when the killer was someone close to the victim. Then Burbeck radioed the Texas Rangers down at the station where he'd sent Manu's family, and one of the Rangers broke the news to Peter that unfortunately his wife's body had been found. Now, by this point, Peter and Manu's oldest daughter, Melanie, had returned from her overnight trip, and their oldest son had also come back from his college campus, and so they were also with Peter and Kiara and Darian at the station. And so the Rangers watched Peter closely as he turned and told the 4 children the news about their mother. The 2 oldest immediately broke down and cried, and Kiara, who had first discovered the blood in the bedroom, collapsed to the floor. But Darian, who said he'd been up all night playing video games, didn't break down. He just walked away and sat in a corner by himself. The Rangers noticed this and actually went to another room to talk about how odd it was that Darian had not started crying and had just sort of sat down. So they decided Darian should be the first person they speak to. And so a few minutes later, one of the Rangers sat down with Darian in an interview room and asked him how he had been getting along with his mother in recent weeks. And Darian admitted that he and his mother had actually been arguing a lot about his college plans. Darian was 20 years old, but he spent basically all of his time in his room playing video games. Now, Darian was perfectly fine with that. He figured he would get his life together at some point, but Manu wanted him to act now, to go enroll in college. But Darian said he didn't want to go back to school and just sort of wished his mom would leave him alone. After this, the Ranger just asked Darian point blank if he had anything to do with his mother's death. And Darian was immediately adamant that no, he would never hurt his mom. So the Ranger asked him if he would consent to being fingerprinted, and Darian said yes, of course. Peter was the next to be interviewed, and he was unemotional just like he had been with police at the house. The Ranger thought this was strange, so he pointed out that Peter seemed to be handling the situation quite calmly. Peter explained that his background was he had been in the Army as a part of their Special Forces unit, the Green Berets, and so he had been trained to keep cool under pressure, and that was just what he was defaulting to. But Peter clearly understood what the Ranger was hinting at here, that he was suspicious of Peter, so Peter quickly added that of course he wanted justice for his wife here. And then after that, Peter said very calmly that he also owned a whole lot of firearms and a whole bunch of ammunition, and he'd make sure his wife's killer saw justice one way or the other. The Ranger just stared at Peter for a second, not convinced if Peter really was being genuine about potentially going out and seeking vigilante justice, or if maybe this was just performative, that this was Peter's way of kind of acting out his emotions. And so the Ranger decided to just kind of move on. And he asked Peter, you heard that car start sometime in the morning and you believed it was your wife's car. How did you hear that noise? How did that wake you up? But the violent attack on your wife in your bedroom just down the hall didn't wake you up. Peter said he couldn't really offer an explanation, but he did offer a theory, which was that maybe Manu's killer put their hand over his wife's mouth. Sometimes violent struggles are silent, he said. The Ranger couldn't help but just shake his head. At this point, the Ranger was starting to feel like Peter had already thought of an answer for everything, like he had prepped for this interview. The pair spoke for a bit longer, kind of rehashing details, and then at some point the Ranger thanked Peter for coming in and told Peter that somebody would follow up with him soon. After that, the Rangers would speak to the 2 oldest Allen children separately, and then finally, after the longest day of their lives, the Allen family were told they could go. However, they were told they were not allowed to return to their home because their house was now a crime scene. So Peter made a few phone calls, and a friend agreed to let them stay at his Airbnb until they could go home. The next day, Sergeant Burbeck got a call from the medical examiner who had Manu's autopsy results. The medical examiner revealed that Manu had been stabbed multiple times, and she had defensive wounds on her hands. She had also been strangled, and her neck was broken. And what's more, after Manu had been taken to the lake, the killer had shot her in the face after she was dead. The violence had been even more extreme than Burbeck realized, and this only convinced him further that Manu's killer had to be somebody close to her that had some sort of personal issue with her. Then Burbeck and members of the state police met with forensics investigators who had processed the scene out by the lake, and they had found shoe prints in the mud near Manu's stranded SUV and bicycle tracks that led away from the SUV out of the recreational area and onto the main road. And so while investigators followed up on these shoe prints and bike tracks, word of Manu's murder quickly spread through the small Texas town. Students at Olney High School, where Manu worked, were devastated when they learned of the death of their beloved teacher. And also rumors began to fly, in particular on a Facebook group called Rants and Raves, where citizens of Olney voiced their theories about what they thought happened in the Allen house on the night of the murder. And most of those amateur theories pointed the finger at Peter. And Peter suddenly began noticing that people around town were treating him differently. They were treating him with suspicion. A few days after Manu's death, Peter and his kids were finally allowed to return to their family home. And when they got there, Darian helped his father secure the house by bolting the windows shut, and Peter said he would sleep with a gun under his pillow because he said the killer was still out there. The next morning, Peter was contacted by Burbeck and asked to come in for another interview. And so Peter drove to the station, where Burbeck and a Texas Ranger met him and led him into an interview room. The Ranger began the interview by asking Peter why someone might want to kill his wife. In response to this question, Peter referred to his large collection of guns. He said he had a ton of them, at least maybe 100, and a lot of people knew about them, so he said, maybe somebody broke into the house to try to steal the guns. And actually, Peter said he had a pistol, a communist block pistol, that he kept in a drawer, and when he had finally gotten back to his home the day before, he noticed that that pistol was missing. Burbeck noted everything Peter was saying in his memo pad, and he began to feel even more confident that Peter did have something to do with his wife's murder. Burbeck felt like Peter was trying to influence the investigation by suggesting an angle that would divert attention away from him. So Burbeck and the Ranger stepped out of the room and talked for a second and decided to shift to a more confrontational tone with Peter. So they went back into the interview room and they revealed to Peter that in the master bedroom where his wife was horribly attacked and killed, they had found a bloody sock which matched footprints left by the killer. And it happened to be the exact same type of compression sock that Peter wore because they found socks just like those in his drawer. And so they asked Peter to please explain that. And Peter said he really couldn't. He just kept repeating that he did not hurt his wife. And so at some point, the Ranger asked how someone other than the family would know exactly where Manu kept her car keys, because that's where the footprints went, right next to the fridge, and the keys were gone, and the car was gone. And Peter just lowered his head and stared down at the floor and said again, he just had no explanation. And so Burbeck and the Ranger continued drilling Peter, trying to get more information from him, but Peter really didn't have any more information. He really stuck to this idea that he did not do anything wrong. And so eventually, at the end of the interview, it was clear there was not enough evidence to arrest Peter, and so Peter was told to go home, and that if they needed him again, they'd be in touch. Sergeant Burbeck was sitting in his office that afternoon when he got a report from one of the Rangers who had been out in the field canvassing for witnesses. Burbeck learned that the officer had made contact with an oilfield worker who was on duty in the area near Lake Cooper on the same morning Manu's body had been found. The worker had been out near the recreation area when he noticed someone on a bicycle pedaling away from the lake and in the direction of Olney. The worker stated that this actually struck him as pretty odd because it was so early in the morning, just after dawn, and even though people did bike in that area, he never saw people biking that early in that area. However, the worker said he didn't really get a good look at the person riding the bike. He could only remember that the bicyclist wore shorts and had a backpack on. And so Sergeant Burbeck assigned 2 investigators to contact area businesses along the route from Lake Cooper to Olney to see if any of them had surveillance cameras that were running that morning that maybe picked up some footage of this person on the bike. And sure enough, the investigators found a local bank whose surveillance footage outside had captured an individual on a bicycle wearing shorts and a backpack, just like the oilfield worker had described. Burbeck took a look at this footage and he was unable to make out the facial features of the individual on the bike. However, he was able to glean enough information from the footage about the person's general age, sex, and build to potentially narrow the suspect pool down. Burbeck was also still convinced Peter had something to do with his wife's murder, but he knew he didn't have enough evidence to move forward with an arrest. But what he could do was try to rule out other possibilities, like, for example, Peter's theory about a burglar trying to steal his guns, because if he could rule that out, it would only help strengthen the case against Peter. So Burbeck began looking into recent gun burglaries in the area, and there was only one. And the homeowner who was targeted happened to be the father of a friend of Darian Allen's. Burbeck wondered if that was more than just a coincidence. After all, everyone in the town of Olney was connected by no more than 2 degrees of separation, so maybe it didn't mean anything. But Burbeck knew he would have to dig into it further. So he began reading the reports that were made from this burglary investigation, and in examining the leads that had been developed, one name stood out, and that name was Corey Taylor. Corey was a young guy who was a loner, who was known around town as a troublemaker, and he'd had numerous run-ins with law enforcement. And he also had what looked like a love affair with guns. Burbeck found a video on Corey's Snapchat of him showing off a semi-automatic rifle with a sight attached to it. So Burbeck decided to pay Corey a visit. He drove to Corey's apartment complex and began walking towards Corey's place. And as Burbeck made his way towards the stairwell, he saw something that made him slow down and then back up. Because in the storage space underneath the stairs right in front of him was a bicycle. Burbeck knelt down to inspect the tread pattern on the bicycle's tires, and he wasn't 100% sure, but the treads looked a whole lot like the bicycle tracks that were found down by the lake. Burbeck took a picture of the treads and then proceeded up the stairs to Corey's apartment. When he got to the door, Burbeck knocked, and Corey opened it up. Burbeck introduced himself, and Corey allowed Burbeck inside. And right away, Burbeck noticed that Corey appeared to be very nervous, like he couldn't even stand still. Burbeck asked Corey if he knew about what happened to Manu Allen, and Corey said he was aware of what happened to Mrs. Allen. He said he knew her as Mrs. Allen because he knew her from his high school, Olney High School, where she worked. And he said everybody knew what happened to her. It was horrible. But Corey said he didn't know her well, and he'd never been inside of her house. Burbeck then asked Corey if he owned the bike that was outside under the stairwell. And Corey said no, the bike was not his, it belonged to his friend, Julius Mullins. Burbeck recorded this name in his notepad, and he and Corey talked for a few minutes longer, and then he left. And within a day, investigators had tracked down this new person Corey had mentioned, Julius Mullins, and they brought him in for an interview. Investigators asked Julius where he was on the night of July 6th, and Julius said that he had gone to a party. Afterward, he had gone to Corey's apartment, let himself in, and crashed there. He said he didn't actually see Corey that night, so he wasn't sure if Corey was actually in the apartment or not. And so this sounded pretty odd that he just crashed at Corey's place and didn't even know if his friend was there, but it sounded like the two were close friends and maybe this was normal. And so eventually the investigators just asked Julius if he would submit fingerprints and DNA, and Julius voluntarily submitted both and was then allowed to leave. A day later, one of the rangers who had been working the case returned to Corey's apartment to confiscate the bicycle that Burbeck had seen underneath the stairwell, and as the ranger was approaching the stairs, he suddenly had a chance encounter with someone he was very familiar with. On a whim, the ranger asked this person if he could look at the bottom of their shoes, and the person said, yeah, sure. So the ranger looked at the bottom of their shoes, and when he did, the ranger could barely contain his excitement, because he knew he had just broken the case wide open. Investigators would meet with this person the ranger had just happened to run into, and after that interview, they knew who had killed Manu Allen. Here is a reconstruction of what police think happened to Manu Allen in the early morning of July 7th, 2019. Around 2 a.m., Manu's killer quietly climbed through a window in the garage of the Allens household and then made their way into the hallway of the house. From there, they quietly crept down the hallway and went into the master bedroom where Manu was sleeping in the bed. Now, the killer tried to be quiet, but Manu was a light sleeper, and very quickly, they woke Manu up. And when the killer noticed that Manu was sitting awake in the bed, looking over at them, the killer froze for a second, but then suddenly the killer reached out and grabbed a butterfly knife off the dresser and just jumped on top of Manu before she could do anything, and the killer began furiously stabbing her. Manu tried to shield herself from the knife, but the killer plunged it into her again and again in this frenzied attack, eventually rolling Manu over, jamming her head into the mattress, and then jabbing the knife into her head multiple times. And after the 47th and final stab wound, the killer dropped the knife onto the bed. But the killer convinced themselves that Manu was not dead. She was still breathing. So the killer wrapped their hands around Manu's neck and squeezed as hard as they could until they were sure she was dead. The killer then wiped the knife off on the sheets and then placed the knife into their backpack. Then they took the bed sheets and kind of wrapped them all around Manu, who was on the bed, and then they dragged Manu inside of these sheets off the bed onto the ground. Then the killer casually walked out of the bedroom into the kitchen to retrieve the car keys from the spot where Manu always kept them. And so with Manu's keys in hand, the killer returned to the master bedroom, locking the door behind them, and then they dragged Manu in the bed sheets out the other door of the master bedroom, through the laundry room and the garage, and then outside to Manu's SUV. There, the killer put Manu's body, still wrapped in the sheets, in the trunk, and then they also placed the bike that they had driven over to the Allens' house into Manu's SUV. Once Manu's SUV was all packed up, the killer hopped in the driver's seat and drove 8 miles north to the recreational area by the lake, but as they were driving along, the SUV got stuck. So at that point, the killer hopped out of the SUV and removed Manu from the vehicle and dragged her over to the spot where she would later be found. However, before the killer actually left Manu there, they pulled out a gun and shot Manu in the face, even though at this point Manu was obviously already dead. Then, after covering up Manu's face with some leaves, the killer walked back over to the SUV, took the bike out, and then pedaled away from the scene back towards town. Police would track down Manu's killer and place them under arrest. And then once they were brought into an interrogation room, investigators asked them why. Why had they killed Manu? And that's when the killer claimed that Manu's husband, Peter, had made them do it. The killer said Peter had cornered them at a convenience store and made them get into his car and put a gun to the killer's head and said, "You're going to kill my wife." But as much as investigators had suspected Peter at different times during this investigation, this story didn't make sense with the timeline of the murder. And the forensics, both the fingerprints and DNA, implicated only one person, Julius Mullins. Julius was the owner of the bike who had stored it under the stairs at his friend's apartment, but more importantly, Julius was the ex-boyfriend of Peter and Manu's oldest daughter, Melanie. The pair had dated for a year when Melanie was a junior in high school. Julius's home life was undeniably rough, and there were times when his parents would kick him out of the house and he would have no place to sleep. Sometimes the only high school coaches would let Julius, who played tight end for the football team, sleep in the gym. And on at least one occasion, when Julius had been kicked out, Manu had allowed Julius to sleep over at their house. And also, Julius was a frequent visitor to the Allens' household, but just for the day, he'd come over for a couple hours at a time to see Melanie. And so it was during these frequent visits that Julius learned where Manu kept her car keys, which is how he knew where to go in the kitchen to find them. Manu always treated Julius incredibly kindly because she was just a person who really looked out for the kids in this town. I mean, she was always spending her spare time looking after kids and mentoring kids and tutoring kids, especially kids who had rough home lives like Julius did. And so Julius was no exception to her kindness. Manu would sometimes help him with his homework and, talk to him and make sure he was doing okay. But during Manu's daughter's relationship with Julius, it seemed like Julius's behavior began to change. He was very temperamental and moody and just seemed like he was snowballing. And so eventually, Melanie broke off the relationship, and Manu kind of stopped talking to him as well, and Julius did not take it well. And this was about 7 months prior to the murder. Police noticed that when they brought Julius in for his first interview, that he had cuts and scrapes all over his arms and legs. And when that ranger went to retrieve the bike from Corey's apartment, Julius was the person he ran into who he was very familiar with because of this case. And he asked Julius to see the soles of his shoes, and when Julius showed him, it was immediately apparent that they matched the shoe prints that had been found by the lake where Manu's body was discovered. The shoes were later found to be an exact match, and the treads on Julius's bicycle were also an exact match to the tracks that were found leaving the scene. Investigators also performed a sound test at the Allen residence, with one ranger in the master bedroom and the other on the couch where Peter had been asleep, and they turned the TV on in the living room to a low volume, as it had been the night Peter fell asleep on the couch and Manu was later murdered. And the ranger in the master bedroom shouted and yelled and made all this noise, and the ranger in the living room could not hear a thing. That's how poorly sound traveled in the Allen household, which is a big reason why nobody heard what was going on in the master bedroom. And also, Kiara, when she had fallen asleep, she had her earbuds in, which did already degrade her ability to hear what was going on in the house. And Darian really had been upstairs with headphones on, which also affected his ability to hear what was going on in the house. So really, nobody heard anything. As for the knife that was found in the bedroom, it was determined to have not been the murder weapon. The knife that was used to kill Manu was found in Julius's backpack. and Peter's stolen communist block pistol was found in the home of Corey Taylor, Julius's friend, but Corey was found to not have been involved with the murder at all. Julius would eventually come clean and would admit that Peter actually had nothing to do with the murder and that Julius had acted totally alone. And it would turn out Peter's theory about the murder, the idea that somebody had maybe tried to break in to steal his guns, but then inadvertently killed his wife, seemed to be at least partially right. Julius claimed when he snuck into the house, he was looking to steal Peter's guns. Julius said he was in the process of stealing an unsecured gun from a cabinet in the master bedroom when Manu woke up. And he said his fight-or-flight response kicked in, and it led him to stab her 47 times and then strangle her, and then eventually later on also shoot her in the face post-mortem. Julius Mullins, who was 18 years old, pled guilty and was ultimately sentenced to 55 years in prison.
It was past midnight in June of 2020 in Sandusky, Ohio, and 25-year-old Lauren Wells lay in her bed wide awake. She had to be up early for work and had been trying to fall asleep for hours, but all night long, the faint sound of music coming from her upstairs neighbors had made sleep impossible. The tune they kept playing was extremely irritating. Sometimes it was very generic sounding, like elevator music. Then it seemed to switch to some kind of strange experimental jazz. Lauren had just moved into her apartment and didn't want to cause any trouble with her new neighbors, but they clearly were not stopping anytime soon. So she finally climbed out of bed and grabbed her broom. She was just about to knock on the ceiling with her broom when the direction of the music suddenly changed. Now it sounded like it was coming from next door. Lauren shook her head in frustration. She didn't want to start a fight with the entire complex, so she climbed back into her bed and threw her pillow over her head. She could still hear the music, but eventually she drifted off to sleep. The next morning at 8 a.m., Lauren arrived at her job as a nursing home administrator. She had just been hired 2 months ago, and she was proud that she'd gotten this position at such a young age. Running the nursing home was Lauren's dream job. She loved interacting with the elderly residents and wanted to make a difference in their lives. So even though she was running on fumes at this point from a lack of sleep, Lauren pushed through the day, checking in on staff and residents, and running various meetings. Thankfully, it was a Friday, so Lauren had the weekend to look forward to. She and her friends were heading to one of the islands off of Lake Erie, which is one of the Great Lakes. Lauren hoped some time outdoors would help her regain some energy. And the weekend getaway was just what she needed. The sun was out, there was a gentle breeze over the lake, and the water was cool and refreshing. Lauren was excited to reconnect with her best friends, and on their first night out, they went out to dance and have some drinks. She forgot about work and her annoying neighbors and just enjoyed herself. But as the evening progressed, Lauren found herself using the bathroom more than usual, but she figured it was just because she was drinking. A little while later, when she was on the dance floor, she felt a sharp pain on her left side. The pain stayed with her the rest of the night. She thought it was menstrual cramps and did her best to ignore them. Nothing was going to stop her from having a fun weekend. And by the time she got home Sunday night, she was feeling better, just like she had hoped. But soon after Lauren stepped into her apartment, her good mood evaporated. Her neighbors were playing that annoying elevator music again. The faint melodies seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lauren dropped her bags and shook her head. She wasn't going to let this upset her. It was late and she knew she needed to get some sleep. So she unpacked and got ready for bed. But just like before, it was impossible to relax with that music coming through the walls. She tossed and turned for hours until finally exhaustion overtook her. When Monday morning rolled around, Lauren was definitely not feeling well. She figured she was paying for her weekend of partying, so she tried to shake it off. She made herself a cup of coffee and got on the treadmill for her daily run. But she'd only been on the treadmill for a minute when once again she felt an intense pain in her left side and had to stop running. It almost felt like someone was punching her hard, but from the inside. This pain went far beyond menstrual cramps. She figured something else had to be going on. Lauren thought back to everything she did at Lake Erie. She wondered if she had pulled a muscle while she was out swimming,
It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't think of anything else that would explain the pain. Lauren had no idea how she was going to get through the day, much less the week, but she didn't want to call in sick. She was still new to her job, and people were counting on her. So she slowly got dressed while wincing in pain and got ready for work. And as she did, she thought to herself, at least her neighbors weren't playing that god-awful music. Once Lauren arrived at work, she did her morning rounds and sat down at her desk to take care of some paperwork. But as hard as she tried, she just couldn't focus. There was something distracting her. It was that weird music she kept hearing in her apartment. It made no sense that the same music would be playing in the nursing home. Lauren looked around just to see if there were any speakers nearby, but there was none. She tried to ignore the disjointed melody, but it was impossible. It seemed like it was coming from everywhere. But then she realized something that made her heart start racing. If there really wasn't any music actually playing right now, that could only mean one thing. The music was only happening in her head. She wondered if she was going crazy, but before she jumped to any conclusions, Lauren thought of someone who might be able to help her. She had a friend who was an audiologist, which is a doctor that specializes in hearing. Lauren called her right away and explained what was going on. She described the strange, repetitive sound and said it was following her everywhere. Lauren's friend listened patiently, then told her that what she was describing sounded upsetting, but it actually wasn't uncommon. She promised that Lauren was not going crazy. She said that sometimes people can hear melodies in everyday noises, like busy traffic or the hum of air conditioners, and just like songs that get stuck in your head, these sounds can do the same thing. Since Lauren was clearly so tired, she was probably more susceptible to hearing these noises. Her friend was sure that once Lauren just got some quality sleep, this weird music she was hearing would go away. Lauren was relieved, but also frustrated. The music was actually the thing keeping her from sleeping in the first place. But she was glad to know that if she could just get some rest, maybe her life would go back to normal. As the week went by, Lauren did her best to stay relaxed, but the music in her head just would not stop, and it continued to make sleep nearly impossible. And so a few days after talking to her friend, Lauren again dragged herself to work, and as she headed down the hall toward her office, she noticed a new odd sensation. Her hands felt like they were covered in a thick layer of dirt, and they felt sticky too, almost as if a glue stick had melted in her palm. She kept scrubbing her hands with soap and hot water, but she couldn't get them to feel clean. Lauren was totally confused. She'd never felt anything like this before. And it wasn't long before that same sensation spread to her feet. Lauren felt like her socks were glued to her toes. At first, it was just a little bit irritating, but then it became totally unbearable. She started going barefoot at work, which helped a little bit. She realized it was weird, but she couldn't stand the thought of putting her shoes and socks back on. Lauren was afraid that there was a connection between her auditory hallucinations and now her hands and feet feeling dirty all the time. But she had no idea what that connection could be. Lauren's instinct was telling her to go see a doctor, but she imagined how ridiculous it would all sound. She hung on to what her friend, the audiologist, had told her about feeling better with some rest. And so Lauren convinced herself that this was the weekend she would finally get some sleep and all these problems would just finally go away. That Saturday night, more than 2 weeks after her strange symptoms had begun, Lauren climbed into bed exhausted. She tried to ignore the strange soundtrack playing in her head, her sticky hands and feet, and the dull pain still in her left side. She pulled the comforter up to her chin, and she tried to meditate, letting the sounds of birds outside her window lull her to sleep. But after a few minutes, Lauren's eyes flew open. She realized that the birds singing outside her window were seagulls. Seagulls live near water, and there was not an ocean or a lake anywhere near her. The seagulls got louder and louder, and finally sounded like they might just fly right into her room at any second. Lauren knew that no amount of rest was going to make them go away, because just like the music, these squawking seagulls were in her head. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see a doctor. Almost 500 miles away in Easton, Pennsylvania, Lauren's father, Brad, was sound asleep at home when his phone rang. He saw Lauren's name on the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. She wouldn't be calling so late if something wasn't wrong. After he answered the phone, Lauren told him what had been going on for the past couple of weeks. She had reached the point where she was so worried about her symptoms that she was heading to the emergency room to get checked out. Brad could hear the panic in her voice, and that made him scared. He was fully awake now, calculating how long it would take him to drive to Ohio. He jumped out of bed and reached for his clothes, telling Lauren he was on his way, but she told him he should stay home. She wanted to see what the doctor had to say before he made such a long trip. Brad reluctantly agreed to hold off, but he told Lauren to call as soon as she had any answers. 30 minutes after talking to her father, Lauren arrived at the emergency room. She took a breath and then described her symptoms to the admissions nurse, expecting to get some strange looks. But the nurse just nodded and took some notes. Then Lauren was sent back to see a doctor who performed an exam and drew her blood. Lauren waited anxiously as they processed her results. And after a little while, the doctor approached Lauren's hospital bed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression seemed totally relaxed. He told Lauren that her tests were completely normal. He didn't think anything was really wrong with her. As he spoke, he flipped through her chart and asked about her work. She explained she'd recently moved and started a new job. The doctor nodded and said he understood, and he said, Lauren, you're probably just stressed. And then he prescribed her some anti-anxiety medication, and he gave her an order to see a psychiatrist. Lauren was frustrated with the doctor's diagnosis, but he seemed to be certain there wasn't anything else going on with her. So Lauren left the ER feeling somewhat unsettled, and on the way home, she called her father, Brad. Lauren could always rely on him to be supportive and honest with her. She told him how annoyed she was that all these doctors just assumed she was stressed because of her new job. But she was thriving there and loved the new challenge. It didn't make sense to put the blame solely on stress. Her dad said he totally understood her frustration, but the doctors knew what they were doing. He asked Lauren to at least start taking the anti-anxiety medication. With any luck, they'd let her get some sleep, and then at that point, with a clear head, she could reassess her situation. Lauren was not convinced, but she promised her dad that she would try. Later that week, Lauren drove to work as usual. She'd been taking her anxiety medication, but so far, it really wasn't helping. She still heard all the mysterious music playing everywhere she went, and so she really wasn't getting more than an hour or two of sleep at night. She gulped down some strong black coffee, but nothing could cut through her brain fog. She'd been a zombie at work all week, often losing track of what she was supposed to be doing. Lauren turned into the parking lot, pulled into her parking spot, and then got out of her car, and as she walked towards the building, she left the engine running and her keys in the ignition, and her laptop and purse were still on the passenger seat. Lauren entered the conference room in a daze. She felt like she was moving in slow motion, and she barely registered the team of nurses who were already there for the weekly staff meeting. Lauren sat down at the table and tried to read the agenda, but the words looked like a jumble of hieroglyphics. At some point, Lauren tried to say something, but nothing came out of her mouth. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, who were now staring at her in confusion, and suddenly, Lauren realized she had no idea how she had gotten there or what she was supposed to do. The nurses who were at the meeting with Lauren could tell something was wrong with her. They helped Lauren lie down on a nearby sofa and took her blood pressure, which was extremely high. She could hear another nurse calling 911. Lauren tried not to panic, but the fear was overwhelming. Then her mind went totally blank. By the time the ambulance arrived, Lauren was starting to come out of her trance-like state. The fog that had been clouding her mind had lifted, and she felt more clear-headed than she had in a long time. She insisted that she did not need to go to the hospital, but the staff wouldn't hear of it. And so, after some gentle coaxing, they convinced Lauren to get in the ambulance. The paramedics took Lauren to a local hospital where doctors ran a series of tests. As she waited for the results, she felt surprisingly calm. She was so relaxed that she began texting her friends to come hang out with her in the hospital. She said she was having a great time. Lauren's friends were taken aback by these text messages. They knew what she was going through, and this just didn't sound like her at all. A little while later, Lauren's father, Brad, was busy at work when his cell phone rang. He'd been on edge the whole week, worrying about his daughter. When he saw it wasn't her number, he felt relieved. But then he realized the person calling him had an area code from Sandusky, the town where Lauren lived. Brad's stomach tightened as he answered. It was one of Lauren's friends. She told Brad that Lauren was in the hospital and that she was not doing well. This time, Brad didn't hesitate. He raced home, threw some clothes in a suitcase, and sped off to make the 7-hour drive to Sandusky. Meanwhile, Lauren was waiting at the hospital for more test results. One of her close friends, who had come to the ER, was sitting next to her. When the doctor came back to Lauren, he gave her some good news. Her test results had all come back negative, just like before. They couldn't explain what had happened to her at work, but physically she was fine and she could be discharged. Lauren thanked him, then she turned to her friend and said that it must have been another false alarm. But Lauren could tell her friend still looked worried. And deep in her heart, Lauren knew she wasn't okay, no matter what these tests said. Her symptoms might have temporarily gone away, but they were going to return, and as she thought about that, she began to feel this terrible dread come over her. Lauren asked the doctor if there was any other alternative to being discharged. The doctor hesitated, and then he said yes, there was, but it was drastic. Seven hours later, Brad finally arrived at the hospital in Sandusky, and he raced to the admissions desk. Just moments earlier, his daughter had called him with the stunning news that she was admitting herself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital. And so Brad, all he wanted to do was just get to his daughter. Once he entered the patient area, Brad was greeted by a doctor and brought to Lauren's room. But he was only allowed to see her through a shatterproof glass window on her locked door, and what he saw shook him to the core. Lauren was writhing on the floor, screaming and begging to be let out. She was trying to tear off her shirt. Food was splattered on the walls, and an empty tray and plate were upside down on the floor. Brad was stunned. Lauren had called him just a couple of hours earlier and seemed fairly clear-headed, and so he didn't understand how her condition could have changed so drastically. The doctor explained that he was giving Lauren medicine to treat schizophrenia, which is a serious mental disorder that causes people to hallucinate and experience delusions. They'd already started on her medication, but it would need time to take effect. Brad shook his head in disbelief. There was no history of mental illness in their family, and Lauren had always been so happy and well-adjusted. The doctor could only shrug. Schizophrenia did have a tendency to run in families, but it also struck out of the blue, usually in young adults anytime between their late teens and early 20s, and Lauren was 25. The diagnosis was terrifying. Brad was desperate to do something to help, but all he could do was wait for Lauren's medication to kick in. It was early in the morning when Brad left the hospital after Lauren had finally calmed down. He checked into a nearby hotel and sank into an exhausted sleep, thinking about his daughter and praying that she would be back to her normal self by the time he woke up. After sleeping for a few hours, Brad returned to the hospital, and when he got there, the nurse gave him a rundown of Lauren's condition. She said Lauren had begged the staff to use their hospital phone, and then when they said yes, she had called friends and relatives repeatedly, forgetting she'd already spoken with them. She'd also become very aggressive with the hospital staff. Brad insisted on going into his daughter's room, so they unlocked her door and he walked in softly, not wanting to scare her. Lauren was sitting on a rumpled bed staring into the distance. Her hair was disheveled and there were dark circles under her eyes. He almost didn't even recognize her. Brad struggled to stay calm as he sat down next to Lauren. He tried to comfort her and asked her if she needed anything, but she didn't respond. The medications she was on didn't seem to be working, but the doctor said it could take a while to kick in. Without anything else to hold on to, Brad clung on to that hope. Over the next few days, Brad anxiously waited for Lauren to improve as doctors tried different combinations of medications. But on the 5th night after Lauren was admitted to the psych ward, things got even worse. Brad had gone back to his hotel, and in a routine that had become too familiar, a phone call startled him awake. It was someone from the hospital. Lauren had experienced a massive seizure and was being transferred to the ICU for further testing. Brad ran to his car, and by the time he arrived at the ICU, Lauren was heavily sedated. He flagged down a doctor in the hall and bombarded her with questions, but it was clear that the doctor was just as much in the dark as he was. All she knew was that Lauren was in critical condition, and they were trying to figure out what was wrong. Afterward, in the waiting room, Brad called friends and family to update them. He tried to piece together everything that had happened to her in the last several weeks, hunting for any clues that might explain her illness, but all he had was a long list of strange symptoms and events. Brad didn't know what to do, but he was desperate for answers, and so he began mentally going through his list of friends who might have some perspective that could be useful right now about Lauren. And as he did this, one name came up that he and Lauren both had in common: Ken Zemanek. Ken was the father of twin girls who were Lauren's best friends from childhood, and he was also a psychiatrist. And so Brad hoped Ken could provide some perspective about Lauren's mental state. When he got Ken on the phone, Brad was afraid that Ken would tell him the same things as all the other doctors, that it was possible Lauren had schizophrenia, or that Brad just needed to be patient and wait for more test results. But once Brad finished going through Lauren's extensive list of strange symptoms, Ken didn't say a word. After a long pause, he said that the hallucinations and mood swings did point to a mental issue. But what troubled Ken was the seizure. Schizophrenia couldn't have caused that to happen. Ken paused again, and then told Brad he did have another thought, one that could potentially explain everything that had been happening to Lauren. He described it as a, quote, rare bird, or extremely rare condition. He suggested that Brad ask Lauren's doctors to test her for this rare condition. Brad listened intently. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. After Brad hung up with Ken, Brad Googled anything he could find about this rare disease Ken had mentioned. And the more he read about it, the more convinced he became that it was what was happening to Lauren. Brad headed straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with one of Lauren's doctors right away. For the first time since Lauren's nightmare had started, he felt a real glimmer of hope. The on-duty doctor arrived, and Brad told him about his conversation with Ken Zemanek, but the doctor was hesitant to test for it right away. The condition Brad described was incredibly unusual, and they needed to test for more common conditions first. Brad immediately tried speaking with another one of Lauren's doctors to see if maybe they would test for it, but that doctor said the same thing. They were going to test for common things first, and this doctor would say that in their entire career, they had never seen a patient with something that rare before. And so a parade of specialists marched in and out of Lauren's room, but every test they ran was inconclusive. As the hours ticked by, Brad's frustration grew. The next morning, Brad arrived at the hospital and headed straight to the ICU. As he walked down the hallway leading to Lauren's room, he heard a commotion of voices and the sound of beeping monitors. He ran into his daughter's room and saw a team of doctors hovering over Lauren. She was lying motionless on the bed and her eyes were closed. Brad stood there in shocked silence until a doctor noticed him and rushed over. He told Brad that Lauren's vital signs were dropping and they were working to get her stabilized. And so Brad needed to leave and go to the waiting area until the situation was under control. But Brad was sick of waiting in a medical twilight zone. His daughter was on the verge of death and they still had no idea what was wrong with her. He demanded they run the tests that he had requested about this rare illness. The doctor hesitated, but then nodded. He finally admitted that they were hitting a total brick wall and were at an absolute loss. But they were at a small community hospital, and so their resources were very limited to both test and treat Lauren for this rare condition if she were to have it. And so if Brad wanted to get her the help she needed, they'd have to transfer her to the Cleveland clinic, which was over an hour away. However, getting there was a huge risk. Lauren was so weak she could die on the transit. Brad was facing the biggest decision of his life. But he didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Lauren was loaded into the back of an ambulance, headed for the Cleveland Clinic. Brad followed behind in his car, praying his daughter could hold on just a little longer. When the ambulance finally arrived at the clinic, a medical team was waiting. Brad quickly parked his car and joined them as the team grabbed the gurney that Lauren was on and rushed her towards the entrance. Brad tried to stay calm as he watched them wheel her to the neurological ICU. Lauren's heartbeat barely registered, and she was having trouble breathing on her own. The doctors told Brad that her brain had also begun to swell, and so they needed to put her into a medically induced coma to help bring the swelling down. Lauren was given a strong sedative through an IV drip to put her into a state of unconsciousness. She was then hooked up to a ventilator that went into her mouth and down her throat to keep her breathing, and a feeding tube was inserted inside her nose and down into her stomach. Brad tried not to show how scared he was, but he knew Lauren was hanging on by a thread. Brad spent the next several hours anxiously pacing in the lobby of the ICU while the heads of several departments at the Cleveland Clinic teamed up in an attempt to save Lauren's life. Finally, one of Lauren's doctors walked in with the results of Lauren's newest round of tests. The doctor was incredulous. Brad and his good friend, Ken Zemanek, had been right. Lauren was sick with something that was so unheard of, most doctors would never think to even test for it. She had a disease called anti-NMDAR encephalitis. Anti-NMDAR is extremely rare, affecting only 1 out of 1.5 million people per year. It had only been identified 13 years earlier in 2007. The disease causes severe inflammation of the brain, which then results in hallucinations and a total psychotic breakdown. This explained almost all of Lauren's symptoms, like hearing the strange music and the seagulls and the sticky feelings on her hands and feet. But it turned out that NMDAR by itself wasn't what caused Lauren to get so sick. The doctor explained that the disease usually signified a deeper, even rarer underlying condition, which would have caused Lauren's other symptoms, like the pain in her side and the frequent need to urinate. Those symptoms were caused by a tumor in her ovary called a teratoma. Teratomas usually strike young women. This kind of tumor is made up of tissue from other parts of the body, like hair, muscle, nerve, organ, or bone. Normally, when the immune system recognizes a tumor in the body, it creates antibodies to try and kill it off. However, the specific type of antibodies formed from a teratoma can end up targeting more than just the tumor. They can also attack the brain and cause anti-NMDAR. In trying to defend her body against this tumor, Lauren's brain had accidentally attacked itself. Brad nearly collapsed from relief. They had a clear-cut answer for what Lauren was up against. It meant they weren't working in the dark. Now they just needed to get the tumor out. A surgeon removed the teratoma the next morning. It was 13 centimeters long, so more than 5 inches long. And unfortunately, it was malignant, which meant Lauren needed chemotherapy in order to fully recover. For the next 2 weeks, Lauren stayed in a medically induced coma. Once she was finally awakened, she couldn't remember anything that had happened to her. She had to relearn how to walk and how to talk, but day by day she got stronger and was finally well enough to go home. 6 months later, Lauren got the news they'd all been hoping for. She was now officially cancer-free. After a full recovery, she went on to graduate from school and earned an advanced degree. Then, in April of 2022, she took a new job as executive director of a senior living facility. She never heard phantom elevator music or seagulls again.
One afternoon in September of 1951, a 53-year-old father named Adolphus Eller carried a large cardboard box from his car toward a boarding house in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He took the box inside and then went down a hallway and then into the room where his 21-year-old daughters, whose names were Bobby and Betty, were busy unpacking. Now, for Bobby and Betty, they were both really excited about moving into this boarding house. They had recently decided to, at the same time, move out of the home they had grown up in, which was in a town about an hour away, which is where their dad, Adolphus, and his wife were currently living. They had decided to move here and get a job at a cigarette factory. They were both going to work there and live in this boarding house, and it was like a big deal for them. They were, becoming adults. And so for them, they were really excited, but, for their dad, Adolphus, it was bittersweet. On the one hand, he was incredibly proud of them for becoming adults, so to speak. But on the other, it was, sad to see his little girls becoming adults. And so even though they were now, off on their own, they were still together, literally living in this boarding house together and working at the same factory. And so he knew that even though he couldn't be there and neither could their mom, to make sure they were okay, they would have each other, they'd look after each other. And so in a way, he knew they'd be okay. So Bobby and Betty, they were not just, close siblings. They were actually identical twins. I mean, they had a really, really deep bond that likely only comes with being a twin. And even amongst, identical twins who are very close with their sibling, it seemed like Bobby and Betty had like a really intense relationship that really went way past whatever was normal amongst identical twins. I mean, they really leaned into being identical twins. So they both were 5'3". They both had sort of round faces and dark hair, and they made sure they always styled their hair exactly the same way. But then just beyond their physical appearances being obviously very similar and, styling themselves to look very similar, they also had very, very similar personalities and interests, almost to the point where it was forced. They were both very social, very outgoing, and they both played the piano, and they sang in the glee club at school, and they both made good grades. But also, they seemed to share things that didn't seem possible really to share. For example, they had a tendency to get sick at the same time, but with illnesses that were not necessarily contagious. Like one time, Bobby had developed an abscess on one of her teeth, and she was really sick from it. And kind of inexplicably, Betty got an abscess in her tooth. Like, this is not something she could feign. It was like she just developed the exact same thing at the same time as her twin sister. And then any time, although it was pretty rare, that the sisters were different in some capacity, often because it was forced on them in some way, the sisters would very intentionally sort of do things to recorrect and become similar again. For example, when Bobby had to get glasses because she had bad eyesight, Betty begged to get glasses herself, despite the fact her vision was much better than Bobby's, but she still got those glasses so they could be the same. And now, their big move out of the house involved getting the exact same job at the same factory and living in the same room in the boarding house. And so it really was just a continuation of the same behavior they had always exhibited. Now, there was a part of Adolphus and also his wife that, secretly hoped that Bobby and Betty might eventually become more independent of each other. Like, that seemed like the healthy route for them to eventually take. But as he set down the last box of their things on the floor and looked at his daughters, who had the same identical excited smiles on, he actually found himself feeling grateful that they were kind of taking this leap in tandem like they always would. He just felt like, what, I just feel like this is a good intermediary step. Let them be dependent on each other for now. It's a good bridge into adulthood. So eventually, after a few minutes, Adolphus said, okay, I'm going to take off now. Best of luck. I love you. Be in touch whenever you need to. And then he left and he headed back home. 2 years later, Adolphus set the dining room table while his wife finished cooking in the kitchen inside of their home in the small town of Pearl, North Carolina. And Adolphus had just put down the last dinner plate when he heard a knock at the front door. And right away, he felt so excited because he knew that, it's the weekend and my daughters always come to visit me every weekend. That's them. Bobby and Betty are here. They're here for dinner. They're going to stay for the weekend. And Adolphus and his wife, they really cherished their time with their daughters ever since they had left to go to the factory. So Adolphus, very excitedly, heads to the door and he opens it up and he's really surprised at what he sees. It was Bobby, but Betty wasn't there. And when he said, where's Betty? Is she in the car? Bobby said, no. And then also Adolphus took stock of the fact that Bobby had some luggage with her and she looked really sad, depressed almost. And he said, Bobby, what's going on? And she said, I hated my job at the factory. I hated it. So I just quit and I'm coming home. And Betty, she doesn't hate her job. She's going to stay. She's going to keep working at the factory and continue to live out there. And for Adolphus, this really is a huge shift in their behavior. I mean, this is not something that these twins ever really did. They did basically everything together. Even if one didn't necessarily want to do the thing the other was interested in, they would often just do the same things, again, to sort of mimic each other and be similar and just do everything the same. And so the idea that they're doing such drastically different things, one coming home and leaving the job, the other continuing to live out on her own, was just a huge departure. And then on top of that, Adolphus said to Bobby, he's like, okay, well, of course you can stay here. Of course you can come home, but where's Betty? Is she gonna be here for the weekend? Is she gonna come home and visit with you? She can keep working there, but is she visiting this weekend? And Bobby was like, no, she's gonna stay. She's actually not coming home this weekend. She's decided to stay. And so again, it just felt like, what's going on here for Adolphus and his wife? This is a crazy big shift. But, very quickly Adolphus said, look, just come on in, have dinner, get situated, we'll talk about this, we'll figure out, what your next steps need to be. But of course you can stay here and everything will be fine. And so Bobby, she picked her stuff up, she came inside, but then she quickly said she was not hungry and did not want to eat with them. And then she just went up to her bedroom, brought her stuff inside the room, shut the door, and didn't come out again. And over the next 2 years, Bobby continued to basically just stay in her bedroom. She rarely left her room. She just closed herself in there and shut down almost entirely. She never talked to her parents about really why she left the factory or what she hated so much about the job that forced her to quit. She didn't talk about anything. She didn't reconnect with old friends or seek out new ones. In fact, she became incredibly introverted. Whereas before, when she and her sister were both living under this roof, they both were very extroverted. They were always out doing social things. And now, Bobby is like a recluse in the room. She also was not showing any sign of making moves to change her current situation. She wasn't seeking a job. She wasn't looking for new opportunities. It was like she sort of had just declined to the point where she just was going to stay in her bedroom in perpetuity. But over the course of those 2 years that Bobby was home, there were several moments where she would sort of snap back and be herself again, the sort of extroverted, happy, social, normal version of Bobby that her parents were used to. And that was when Betty would come home from the factory to visit on the weekends. It was like when Betty walked in the door, Bobby became reanimated and became her old self. And the two just immediately fell into rhythm as if no time had passed, like there's no ill will towards each other about the fact that they're not working at the factory or living together anymore. It was like everything went back to normal. And then Betty would leave to go back to the factory, and Bobby would go back to her room and shut the door. And so for Adolphus and his wife, part of them had always hoped that these two, would eventually separate and kind of learn to live independently. But even though Betty, who was staying out at the factory and living on her own, appeared basically to be doing okay on her own, it just seems sort of obvious that Bobby was just completely falling apart without her sister. She was utterly dependent on her. I mean, it was so clear. And so Adolphus really didn't know, how this was going to play out. It just sort of seemed like over time, this was definitely getting worse, certainly for Bobby. But around the time that Adolphus and his wife are sort of trying to figure this out, what to do about Bobby, 2 years in to her being home, right around that same time frame, so 2 years in, Betty sort of inexplicably came home one Friday and said, you know what, I quit the factory too, and I'm going to live here as well. And in a weird way, Adolphus and his wife were relieved because it meant that realistically, the daughters would almost certainly fall back in step with each other and return to their normal selves. And really, for Bobby's sake, it seemed like this would be an enormous, plus in her life. I mean, she really was falling apart here, and they had seen how happy she was every time Betty came home to visit over those 2 years. And so there was a relief that Betty was home. But there was also it didn't really make sense that Betty was quitting her job. I mean, really, it seemed like she liked her job. She seemed to be doing well on her own. Adolphus couldn't necessarily prove this, but he believed that ultimately what Betty must be doing here is what she and her sister always did, which is we will do the same things even if we don't necessarily want to. Like Betty basically was sacrificing her independent life to come back home and be with her sister and sort of fall into step like they always did. That's what it seemed like. But again, it seemed like the silver lining was, at least our daughters will be normal again. They'll be happy and healthy again. But that is not what happened. Once Betty came back home, she quit the factory and she and Bobby are now living once again under the same roof. They absolutely did fall back in step with each other like they always had done. But their connection to each other, their dependence, their attachment on each other was so extreme, way more than before. And before, it was already extreme. So this is like way beyond what's reasonable. They basically went into the bedroom where they both were living, which was Bobby's bedroom. Now Betty was living in there as well. They went into that bedroom and just shut the door and just stayed in there together, basically 24/7. So they did not, become the extroverted girls that they used to be. They became introverted, but together. They didn't seek out jobs. They certainly didn't show any interest in getting jobs. They, again, were not socializing. They just stayed in that room basically 24/7. They slept in the same bed. And then in the rare times that they would leave the bedroom, they would walk side by side, like they were touching shoulders, like everywhere they went. They had to basically be on top of each other. And they also moved almost like in sync, like robots. They were just doing the exact same thing. And then anywhere they went, they could not separate. Like any room they went to in the house, they were together. Go to the bathroom, they're going together. I mean, everything was together. It was a level of attachment that the parents had never seen before. Now, of course, Adolphus and his wife were concerned about this. They didn't really know even what to call what they were seeing. It just seemed like codependency to a fault. But they were sort of hoping that, eventually the girls would kind of level out again and they'd get their lives back on track, even if they retained that really intense bond. But then it got worse. In addition to basically shutting themselves in this room all the time and, never being apart from each other, they also stopped eating. At first, it just seemed like they were, just not interested in dinner. Adolphus would go up to the bedroom and he'd knock on the door and it would open a crack and both Bobby and Betty's faces would come to the door at the same time. And Adolphus would say, hey, dinner's on the table. Do you want to come down to eat? And the girls, without even looking at each other, would say in perfect unison, we're not hungry. And then they would shut the door. And it was like, okay, I guess they just don't want to eat. But then weeks would go by and the girls would just refuse to come out and eat. And so the girls began to lose a considerable amount of weight, like an unhealthy amount of weight. But no matter what Adolphus and his wife did, they just would not eat. And so after a couple of weeks of this, Adolphus and his wife decided that, they clearly were not going to get through to their daughters and get them to change their behavior just by presenting them with logic. Hey, you really ought to come down here and eat because you have to eat to survive. Like, they're not listening to that. There's something going on here. And it seemed increasingly obvious that it was mental, that these girls were really struggling with some sort of mental illness. At least that was the parents' suggestion. And so they brought their daughters to go see a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist very quickly actually made a diagnosis. They said that Bobby and Betty both had schizophrenia, which is a very serious chronic brain condition that affects the way you think, the way you behave. Basically all the ways in which you interact with the world can be gravely affected by schizophrenia. And so a lot of their strange behaviors or their anomalous behaviors, in particular, their not eating and their codependency, the psychiatrist believed could basically be explained by schizophrenia. And so ultimately, the psychiatrist prescribed Bobby and Betty some antipsychotic medication and promised Adolphus that if they take these meds, they'd be okay. But even though Adolphus and his wife ensured that Bobby and Betty took their medication exactly as they were supposed to every single day, the twins did not seem to get any better. If anything, they actually continued to get worse. They spent, if anything, more time, locked in their bedroom, and they became more frail, and they continued to barely eat, and they also began showing signs of being very paranoid around anybody that was not their other sibling, even their own parents. It was like the only person either Bobby and Betty could be around was the other. They couldn't be around anybody else. They just kind of hid themselves away, basically 24/7. And so pretty quickly, Adolphus came to the realization that these antipsychotic meds are not doing enough, or maybe they're not doing anything at all. But at the same time, Adolphus did not think that, the diagnosis was wrong. He believed his daughters did have schizophrenia. The symptoms basically fit, but the treatment wasn't working. And so in Adolphus's mind, he felt like what he needed to do was just get his girls more and better psychiatric help. So in early 1961, when Bobby and Betty were both now 30 years old, Adolphus had them both involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. And at first, it seemed like this hospital stay was exactly what the girls needed. Because, they gained weight back pretty quickly because they were being forced to eat, and they were also being monitored effectively 24/7, and they were given proper medication, and, they were just kind of comprehensively looked after, and so pretty quickly they got better. And also the girls were allowed to stay in the same room together. They really never separated them, which was an important part of their recovery, as they had each other. And so after several weeks in the hospital, they were deemed, healthy and back to normal, so to speak, and they were discharged. But pretty much immediately, once they got back to their family home, they regressed right back to being, secluded in the bedroom, not eating, and being completely introverted and completely not normal, not healthy. And so, again, they were committed. And again, they got better while they were at the hospital. But then once they were discharged and back home, they got worse again, over and over and over again for over a year. It was like they were in and out of the hospital. It just didn't seem like they were making any real progress. And so eventually, Adolphus and his wife and several doctors and nurses that had treated the two girls over the past year during their numerous hospital stays, eventually they all kind of came to the conclusion that it could be possible that what was happening here is these girls had schizophrenia, and that was kind of the root cause of all their issues. Or maybe it was just their intense dependency on each other that was effectively causing all their problems. That what could have been viewed as like this timeless bond between siblings was actually like a really deeply unhealthy codependency where they were so enmeshed in the other that like they couldn't grow as people and become independently functioning adults, that they were kind of stuck, and that unless drastic action was taken, they would continue to be stuck and continue to decline, or at least spiral the way they had been. And so a decision was made to, without asking the girls, to forcibly separate them and see if that made a big difference. And so on April 11th, 1962, Bobby and Betty were both once again committed to the hospital. Except this time, for the first time, they were separated. They were put in literal opposite ends of the hospital in totally separate wards, and they completely lost their minds. The girls begged and screamed and demanded to be kept together. But the staff said, nope, it's for your own good. A few hours after the girls had been separated at the hospital, so this is the first time they're being kept apart. This is like 1 a.m. on the morning of April 12th. Adolphus was at home asleep when his phone rang. And he was confused because it's the middle of the night, like who's calling him? But when he picked up the phone, he heard a hospital doctor's voice on the other end, and the doctor sounded completely frantic. And he tried to explain to Adolphus what was going on. Adolphus was aware of the fact that the girls were going to be separated, but everything the doctor was saying about what had followed after the separation just didn't make any sense. And he was trying to clarify, like, what are you talking about? But the doctor finally just paused and then just clearly stated basically the disaster that had unfolded after the separation, that something they could have never planned for has happened, and even the doctor didn't really know what to make of it. And when Adolphus heard this, he just sat there on the phone, completely frozen, having no idea how to react. Over the next few days, doctors at that psychiatric hospital tried to come up with a rational, scientific explanation for what happened on the night that Bobby and Betty were separated. But they couldn't figure it out. So, in an effort to figure it out, they called in the North Carolina State Board of Investigators for some help. But they couldn't figure it out. And so they called in the FBI. And the FBI couldn't figure it out either. Nobody had any idea how this could have happened or why. And so as this story naturally began to leak out to the press and began circulating in newspapers all over the country as like this unbelievable mystery, a lot of people, as they saw the story, began to wonder if maybe the explanation for what happened after these girls were separated is not rooted in science. Maybe what happened is something that we as humans, we can't really understand, but it doesn't make it any less real. It would turn out at 12:55 a.m. on the night or early morning that Bobby and Betty were separated in the hospital. A nurse in the ward where Bobby had been moved to was doing her regular rounds. And when she got to Bobby's room, she found Bobby lying in her bed on her side, and she was dead. About 5 minutes later, at 1 a.m., a doctor went to check on Betty in the ward where she was on the other end of the hospital, and this doctor found Betty was also dead in her bed, lying in the exact same position that Bobby was. But the strange thing is there was no obvious sign of what killed them. There was no sign of illness. There was no sign of self-harm. There was no sign of violence or foul play. It was like, inexplicably, both of these girls were just dead. And then even after doing multiple autopsies, nobody could figure it out. Like, there wasn't a reason that they died. Forget foul play, forget how it happened. There wasn't a medical diagnosis for what killed them. They just suddenly died. And so the only real conclusion they had was that somehow the twins had died from no apparent cause at almost the exact same time. The twins' cause of death was officially listed as ill-defined and unknown. The only theory that anyone has been able to come up with about what happened came from one of the doctors who treated Bobby and Betty in the hospital. He believed that the twins were so distressed about being forcibly separated that they found a way to reunite by, quote, willing themselves to die. Basically, the twins' need, the spiritual, physical, emotional need to be with the other and having that taken from them was so strong, so powerful, that they basically forced themselves to shut down and die in hopes that their spirits could reconnect. But as crazy as that sounds, there's actually one more very strange detail about the way they died that seems to add a layer of credibility to the idea that whatever happened here is bigger than science. It's something paranormal, it's something supernatural, it's something else. And that was that when they found Bobby and Betty's bodies, just 5 minutes apart from each other on opposite ends of the hospital, they weren't just laying in bed in the same position as the other. No, it seemed like they were positioned sort of awkwardly on their bed. If you think about how a bed works, it's a rectangle and you lay vertically along the bed. The girls were found sort of a little bit at an angle on their respective beds, like they were sort of positioned in a non-natural, non-parallel way with their bed. They were sort of almost perpendicular to the flow of their bed. And at first it was just an anomaly about how they were found. Oh, they died and they sort of got into this position. But then somebody realized if you removed all the walls, just in your mind, if you removed all the walls between each of the rooms they were in, the way they were laying on the bed made sense, because the girls, in their own way, positioned themselves to be looking exactly at each other when they died.
Every window looked temporary. We carried our names like stolen objects, too young to understand permanence. We ran through avenues unfinished by morning. Shoelaces untied, lungs full of static air. Billboards melted in puddles beneath us. Cities bending under fluorescent rain. Nobody taught us moderation, so we treated night like celebration. Laughing with chipped teeth and restless shadows, as if gravity could be negotiated. There was beauty in our instability, in how nothing stayed symmetrical. Even our mistakes moved like fireworks, violent for a second, unforgettable after. We burned the sky without asking permission. Turn
20-something, pressure heavy. Sleep like mine, never ready. Dreams folded in my backpack. Ran through hope, getting shaky. They said do what you love, but they never paid my phone. So I work all night for a future that don't answer when I call home. Eyes red, heart racing, coffee instead of peace. I don't chase fame or fortune, I just wanna breathe. Deadline dreams, chasing me. Running fast, but stuck in between. Deadline dreams, no reset. Living life.
thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge